In the latest escalation of tensions between US and Russia, the Kremlin has squarely blamed the US for the deadly attack on Crimea, which was carried out using US-supplied ATACMS missiles. Now, at least 4 people were killed and 151 were injured in the attack, and Moscow has formally warned the US that a retaliation would follow. For more on this, we are now being joined by Glenn Diesen, who is a professor of international relations at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Glenn, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us here on WION World is One. Tensions have been on the boil between Russia and the US, but directly blaming the US for the recent attack on Crimea takes things a big step further. Do you agree?
Yes, no, very much so. But I think it's because it's becoming very difficult to pretend as if it's not a war between NATO and Russia anymore. Because you mentioned that the ATACMS missiles are American, but the Americans also green-lighted using the missiles inside Russian territory. But furthermore, it's not just the missiles which are American, it's also the flight paths and targets for the ATACMS missiles, which are programmed into it, is done in accordance also, it's done by Americans in accordance with the US satellite intelligence data. So this is very much an American attack on Russia, which is why it's very dramatic. And now that the Russians are identifying the Americans as the culprits and are recognizing that this requires a retaliation, this of course takes us as a huge step now towards direct war.
Now, Glenn, the US has definitely said that Ukraine is free to attack as far as they want or wherever they want it. Basically, targeting is their headache altogether. It's their call. In a way, they've said that Ukraine is free to do whatever it wants with the weapons that US has sent them. And Russia, we all know how it retaliated, or rather how it responded when Britain had suggested this regarding Ukraine, that they are free to do what they want and target where they want, and they have the right to defend themselves, is what David Cameron had said. At that time, Russia had announced nuclear drills, and Belarus had also carried out nuclear drills. So basically, we had nuclear drills around Ukraine on 2 fronts. Now, the US has said that it is over. I mean, it's Ukraine's call what they want to do with the weapons. How do you feel Russia is going to retaliate now that they've said they are going to retaliate?
Well, first on allowing them to use the weapons as they like. I think this is part of the narrative of simply allowing Ukraine to defend itself. But what we really see is that over the past 2+ years, there's been this gradual effort to redefine the unofficial rules of proxy war. Because if we go back to March and April of 2022, when the United States and UK sabotaged the peace agreements between Ukraine and Russia, both the Israeli and the Turkish negotiators made it clear that it was sabotaged because the Americans, British, saw an opportunity to fight Russia with Ukrainians. But still, it was limited. So initially, NATO recognized that, sending tanks, F-16 or long-range missiles to strike in Russia would trigger World War III because it would amount to a NATO attack on Russia. But now they're doing all of these things, which they said before was a crazy escalation. So we have, NATO war planners using NATO intelligence and surveillance, NATO targeting, almost certainly with NATO soldiers to set up the weapon system, program them, and even launch these long-range weapons with cluster munition warheads to strike targets inside Russian territory, even against civilian targets. So this is what for the context, this is the conclusion that the Russians have reached, which is that NATO has attacked Russia now, and they see it as impossible not to retaliate. But again, how would they retaliate? It really depends. I mean, I don't think a nuclear strike would be what the Russians would go for. I think the nuclear weapons are meant as a deterrent, which they would use if they would be defeated in a conventional war. My guess is that they're preparing what's called a bloody nose attack, which is a very limited, targeted strike, which is against, for example, logistics centers or weapon storages on NATO territory. And the purpose of a bloody nose attack would be to send a message without provoking full-scale war. So the goal of such an attack is usually to, demonstrate resolve and capability. And the problem is we don't know how NATO will react once Russia actually retaliates. I mean, will the Americans see this as an opportunity for direct war, or will it even be possible for NATO not to respond? It's very difficult to say.
Glenn, now, we've done a lot of study on this, and the fact the war, more than the war, it's the build-up to a war or having another nation deal with one of America's adversaries. I think that is what works best for the US because that keeps their economy ticking as well. At the moment, what we've seen, you know, with the kind of rhetoric we've seen, both sides are not keen on a direct war with each other. They are like, there is a lot of saber rattling, but there isn't, you know, nobody really wants to get into a final head-on collision at the moment because everyone understands what that will mean for the entire world. But at this point, we've heard earlier as well from a lot of discussions that I've had that Russia is very much likely and it can use tactical nuclear weapons which won't level an entire city, but it will still have a nuclear might behind it. Do you feel Russia is now closer to that point of actually using one and not just using it for its, you know, as drills?
Well, I think that's another step on the escalation ladder. I think they still have other ways of escalating without triggering a nuclear war. And this is the option of targeting American and, well, especially then NATO territory. So probably Poland or Romania, which has plenty of weapon storages and used as logistic centers. The problem for Russia is they're faced with a dilemma because now NATO can effectively attack Russian territory. And the Russians have a dilemma. How do they respond? If they do not respond, then NATO will simply continue to escalate further. You know, why wouldn't they use long-range missiles to bomb Moscow, for example? Doing nothing is feared to embolden NATO. But if they do something, then they could trigger a major war. And this is the dilemma. So far, they've been very apprehensive not to trigger a war with NATO. But the cost of this has been that every red line has just been stepped over by NATO. And if you read the Western newspapers, it's the assumption that Russia would never dare to retaliate, so we can do effectively what we want. And this is why the Russians are under such great pressure now to retaliate, even though it war. I mean, this is comparable to why Iran felt it had to strike Israel. And this is also why, for example, China would feel they would have to use force against Taiwan if they continue to push for secession. It's really this dilemma. It's a cost no matter what they do. It's either they respond or not respond, but either way, it comes at an immense risk.
So a bloody nose, retaliation or a counter with a bloody nose is perhaps what Russia is going to look for, is what Glenn is sharing with us. That was Glenn Diesen. And of course, a lot to discuss as the escalations go on increasing. One would have expected that well into the third year of the Russia-Ukraine war, one would expect things to start, you know, coming down. But it doesn't seem like that. And of course, with the American elections around the corner, one would know what's in store going forward in the Russia-Ukraine war with the new American leadership, if there is or if it is the incumbent. That is going to be, I mean, we will need to wait and track that as well. We will be doing all of that right here in WION World is One. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Glenn Diesen joining us from Oslo. Always a pleasure speaking with you.